So we have our next speaker, Greg. His name is a bit different, but it's hard to pronounce. So he will explain that in his talk itself. He likes Stack Overflow a lot. So he's an empty stack developer. And he also creates a lot of bugs, only to boost the economy and provide income to other developers. So we have Greg from Singapore. He has traveled in 37 countries in last 8 years and finally settled in Singapore. And he will be talking about 1 year with Hanami, the web framework which is making a lot of noise these days in the Ruby community.
Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to 1 year with Hanami. My name is Grzegorz, but really people have troubles pronouncing it, so I always recommend deleting half of the letters and just leave Greg. Works for everyone. I live in Singapore, where I work for a company called Caligo Solutions. We build various products using Ruby, using Rails, Hanami, using also Elixir and some front-end languages. And today I'm going to talk about Hanami. And the word Hanami comes from Japanese language, and it's the name of the long-standing tradition of welcoming spring, where people go together to parks, just grab some beer, and they just watch the trees, they just watch the flowers blossom. And this tradition, this name, this word was inspiration for a name for the Ruby framework created a few years ago by a programmer, Ruby programmer Luca Guidi. So today we won't be talking about the Japanese tradition, we will be talking about the web framework. Now, I believe that even though Hanami is relatively known in the Ruby community, maybe not everyone heard about it, so I will very briefly introduce its attributes. So Hanami is a full-featured web framework. What it means is that it doesn't provide only the libraries to handle HTTP requests, it also gives you libraries to deal with the storage, like handle the models and the database. It gives you libraries to deal with static assets, with mailers, etc. Hanami is modular. What it means is that it lets you use separate libraries without relying on the whole framework. So you can take just the controller library and use it on your own, or you can use the model library without using the web part at all. Hanami is lightweight. What I mean is that it is relatively short. The code is quite short. It is also quite easy to read and understand. Also, it claims to be fast. However, I will not be talking about performance in this presentation, as I don't have much experience with optimizing or any performance issues with Hanami. And finally, Hanami promotes good practices, as in the framework. It doesn't force you, but it makes it easy to use good engineering practices. And I will be talking a lot about it later in my presentation. Now, in my company, we use Hanami because when we started working on a new product, we wanted to use something that we are familiar with, as in we didn't want to learn a new language from scratch. However, we wanted to do a bit of exploration. Like, I personally typed Rails new probably 100 times in my life. And we wanted to just try something new, but not so new that we might later have problems that we cannot solve. So that's why we chose a framework that was written in Ruby, and that's why we chose a framework that was in Rails. Now, a very brief timeline. So we started working on our first Hanami application 1.5 years ago. And since a year ago, we are running application in production. Then we were quite happy with the framework during the initial phase that we started working on a second app. And earlier this year, we upgraded our Hanami applications to version 1.1. The current version of Hanami framework is 1.2. We haven't upgraded to that version yet, so I don't know how much better it is. So all my comments will be regarding version 1.1. Now, in my presentation, I will be talking about 4 parts separately. So first will be the web part, then the data, then the whole application part, and finally the support. So let's start with the web. Hanami framework consists of multiple gems, and the web part consists of 4 gems. First is the router, which is very similar to what you can see in Ruby on Rails. As in, the routes are in a separate file. It's not like Sinatra, where the path, the HTTP path, also describes the action directly. You've got a separate path. However, router is not very interesting, so I won't be talking about it. It just does what you expect to do. Then we have three other gems. One is controller that takes the HTTP requests and handles them and sends the response. Another is view that encapsulates the logic that will be sent to the user. And finally, helpers that help us with formatting the data. Okay, so during this presentation, I will be talking about what we like and what we don't like in Hanami. So I will be using the green color for the things that are good and red color for the things that are not as good as we would expect them to be, okay? So the first thing that we really enjoy in Hanami is that one controller action is one class. What I mean is that you do not have a class, let's say, orders controller that has 7 different CRUD actions. No, one class means one action. This makes it easy to separate all the things that are related to an individual class. And also the classes are very easy to test, because to actually see what your controller will return, you just initiate a new object, the new action.new, then you call it with the parameters that you want, and you get the response. So this is how the directory structure will look like. So you see we've got application called admin. This application has controllers, and then instead of having orders controller in one file, my orders are a directory, and then each action represents just one method, just one HTTP endpoint. Okay, so again, this makes it very easy to test, and it makes the actions very separate. However, the problem with this approach is that it makes it a bit more difficult to notice which parts of code could be extracted, because if you have all the actions related to one resource in one file, then you can easily see what code is duplicated. If you have them spread into 5 or 6 files, it makes it a bit more difficult. Still, we enjoy this approach very much. Now, what we don't like about the controller actions, well, when I say we, actually I mean I. The rest of my team doesn't care about this so much, but I find it a bit tricky. So in the controller action, the only method that you're calling is the method call. Okay? However, what the controller returns is not the same thing as you return from this method. And let me provide you an example. Okay, so I've got my action, and the method call returns a string called thisIsAction. However, when I call this method, when I call index.new.call, it doesn't return thisIsAction. It returns an array where the first element is a HTTP code, the second is our headers, and the third is the body. Okay, so this was initially very confusing for me. I'm like, so this is what I return. I return thisIsAction. Where is this string? And as it appears, to modify the response, you need to modify the attributes of the action. So you can do it in 2 ways. The first is use the method called status, then you provide the HTTP code and then the body. Or alternatively, what you can do is you can change the value of the you can change the accessors of your action. So you just say self body equals thisIsAction, and then self status is your HTTP code. The last method is headers. You can also modify the headers that will be returned to the user. Now, the next thing that we really enjoy is that views and templates in Hanami are separate. So views are objects that encapsulate the logic of the presentation, and templates are basically HTML or JSON code. So let me give you an example again. I've got a view that has a method called usersAge. And now I return some value there. And in my template, the only thing that I do is that I use that method from the view. So the ideal template, according to Hanami philosophy, contains no logic. It just calls the methods that are given that you define in your view. Views, you might think that the views are very similar to Rails helpers. However, they are not included everywhere. So the view that is called index will be, these methods will be available only in the template that describes the index. If you want to use it in multiple templates, then you need to extract it to a separate module and include in the views that you want. And very related thing that we enjoy is that the built-in helpers are private. So Hanami has a gem called helpers that gives you methods like format currency or format number. And Hanami encourages you to not to use these helpers directly in your templates. So again, let me give you an example. For example, we have a helper. Hanami gives you a helper called format number. And in an ideal way, you shouldn't use this method format number directly in the template because it's a logic. And logic should be encapsulated in the view. The template should only render the method that you define in the view. So I'm not sure if all the helpers there are private, but on the Hanami website and in the guides, you can read that this is the recommended way. You should treat these helpers as private, and you should only use them in your view methods. So that sums up the first part, the web. And as you notice, most of the part was green here, and we really enjoy the web part. It feels simpler, and it feels very well structured. We really appreciate that the views and the helpers, the templates, are separate layers, and they do not mix. Or you can, if you really want, you can mix them. But the default way, the preferred way, and the easy way, Hanami makes it easy not to mix these concepts. Okay, let's go to the second part. This is very interesting because I believe that databases, and managing the data flow is always a very controversial topic. So Hanami has 3 gems that are related to managing the data. One is a model, which deals with entities and with interacting with the database. The second one is validations. And the last gem is still in experimental phase. It's called events, and it's about publishing and consuming events. I have no experience with that gem yet, so I will not be talking about it. It hasn't been officially released. I just saw the repository, saw that there is some work on that, so I thought that I should include it so that you can see that Hanami gives you also more and more gems in the future. Okay, so one of the best things related to data in Hanami is that it uses repository pattern. Hanami model gem separates the concept of data storage, which is the repository, and of data model, which is like a single entity. So I believe that most of you have used active record pattern, either via active record library, which is part of Rails, or via some other libraries. And in active record, we mix it's like a repository and entity are together. They are just one class. So you just call user.new, and you've got a new user, and it's an instance of the user class. And you call user.where to query the users. Now, in repository pattern, these things are separate. So entity represents like a single record in the database, but it actually is more of a domain object. So it doesn't have to be mapped perfectly to one database table and one record. While repository itself is kind of like a collection. So the repository doesn't have to be related to the database. Your repository, your storage might be actually just an array. And the repository gives you methods like insert, update, delete, etc. Very simple example. In the repository, we specify associations, and we have queries. Now, interesting thing here is that methods like where are not public. They are private. You shouldn't be using order repository.where outside of the order repository class. So Hanami, just like with helpers and views, etc., it tries to make things private, and you should only expose certain methods that you will be using. And the order itself, the entity, is entirely separate class. It is mapped via naming in Hanami framework, but it is a separate concept. The entity and the repository are just separate. Now, the problem with Hanami model is that it doesn't allow you to do everything that you would like with the database. If you have some complex queries, then you might struggle with it. Now, In version 1.1, it is already improved over the previous versions, but still, sometimes what we want to achieve in the database is not possible with Hanami model. So then we need to go one layer down, which is a library called ROM-RB. And this library gives you a bit lower level abstraction. But it still might not be enough for everything that you want. And then you have to go, again, one layer down, where you go to the library called SQL, and this library allows you to write almost raw SQL queries. So this is something that, that is confusing, because you might be fighting the framework. If you want to use some complex query, it might happen that, that you just shouldn't rely on Hanami model. You should go one or even two layers down. Now, validations. Validations in Hanami are separate from the entities. So the validations are not tied to the database validations. You do not put them in the model, in the entity. Well, you can put them into entity. Actually, you can put them anywhere, because validations are just a mixin that gives you a DSL to validate the data that you're passing. So example is that my first piece of code here is a controller action, and I put params there. And these params perform some validation. So I require the title to be string, and I require a field called amount to be integer. But I can include Hanami validations in a service object, like create order. And then I just put validations, and I require the title to be string. So you can put validations anywhere. They are not tied to entities, to controllers, to service objects. Basically, any layer can use validations. Now, part 3 is the whole application. So we've got two gems here. One is the gem called Hanami, which is actually the application wrapper. So you can use each gem in Hanami separately, but you can just use the gem called Hanami, and it gives you an application framework that uses the controller, view, model, etc. And the last one is CLI. Again, CLI is kind of like router. It gives you everything that you would expect, but it's not extraordinary in any way. So I will be focusing on the Hanami gem here. So the first thing that you will notice when you create a new Hanami application is that actually it creates multiple applications. So your project will have directory called /apps, and the default app that will be created is called web. Now, instead of creating new repository for admin dashboard, you can just create a new application in the same project. Now, what happens is that the controllers, the views, and configuration of these applications will be separate. However, whatever code you put in the lib directory will be reused by different applications. So all your repositories or your entities or service objects can be shared between the applications. But the routes, the views, the templates will be separate. You can think about it as engines in Rails. However, the mountable applications were not added here in the later stage. They are like they're first-class citizens. So during my work with Rails, it always feels like the default way is to have one application, and the engines are something additional. In Hanami, it's the other way around. It's like having multiple applications is the default thing, and the fact that you have just one application is kind of a special case. Now, the problem with the Hanami gem, which is the whole application, is that it's not as modular as I initially expected it to be. So if I want an application that will have controllers, view, and model, but will not use the, I don't know, mailer or some other gem, I can use them separately. But if I want to build the Hanami application, then it will include all these gems. So they will not be required in your code. You don't need to load this code, but the Hanami gem depends on all the other gems. So you cannot have Hanami application without, I don't know, without views. Like you can build it, you don't have to use views, but they will be there, they will be included in your gem file log. So it's not a big downside, it's just something that I didn't expect initially when I started working with the framework. Now, another good thing, and I cannot emphasize this enough, Hanami really promotes good engineering practices. And each gem separately promotes them, but also when you build the whole application, you feel that they really promote separating different layers. and they really promote good practices like making your code easy to test. And this is wonderful feeling when the framework uses something that is really, it just feels really well designed. So this is something that you will notice when you work with an individual Hanami gem, but you will only really appreciate when you see how the whole framework, how the whole application works. So that was the application, and now the last part, which is support. So in support, we have two gems. One of them is Mailer. I haven't used this gem. I only saw how it works, and it basically does what you expect. It sends emails. So we won't be talking about it. However, the other gem called Utils is extremely important because it is kind of an equivalent of active support. It just provides you utility functions and some libraries that you might be using everywhere in your application. The first thing that you notice when you read the code of the utils gem is that there is no monkey patching there. So you do not end up in a situation where you're confused whether the method that you're calling comes from your framework or whether it comes from Ruby language. So all the classes that Hanami, all the core classes like string, basic object, etc., they are not monkey patch. Hanami has wrapper classes. So there is a class called Hanami string, and this class wraps a string class. So it behaves like a string, plus it has additional methods. Now, another good thing in the utils gem are interactors. Interactors are basically service objects, and it's really nice that the framework provides you with a very consistent way to build service objects. I don't know about you, but in my case, in my applications, service objects are like 80% of the classes. I use them basically everywhere, and Hanami gives you a consistent way to implement them. However, the way that they are implemented is not my favorite. So let me explain. They just behave similarly to actions. You see, if I have the interactor, and if I want to return a user, I need to assign the object to the instance variable user. So actually what Hanami returns, what the interactor returns is not the user that you define here. It's a certain result object that will have the user variable if you provide it to be exposed here. So again, this is not a big issue. It's just, since Hanami provides good practices and it emphasizes things like immutability, it just feels weird that in order to return something, you have to modify the state of your object. Now, the last thing, and this is not a problem with the framework itself, but this is a problem that you will notice when you work with the framework. The ecosystem of the Hanami is still small. So if you need authentication library, you don't have a great choice. Like, there are some libraries, but probably you will end up writing your own authentication. Recently, we had a problem with Webpack, so we wanted to use Webpack, and the only library that helped with Webpack for Hanami worked only if you had one application. But in our repository, we had multiple applications, so again, we had to roll out our own solution. Now, once again, to emphasize it, this is not a problem with the framework itself, but when you work with a framework, you often rely on the ecosystem, and in this case, the ecosystem is quite small. To sum up my presentation, you can use Hanami for almost all the web applications, and you can use selected gems, like the model of validations, even in desktop or any applications, just because these gems do not necessarily relate to web. Now, you might reconsider it if you build an application that needs a lot of external libraries, because let's be honest, lots of libraries in Ruby ecosystem, especially when they are web-related, they are written to work with Active Record library or with some other Rails libraries. So if you know that there are libraries that will be hard to find, that there might not be possible to find certain libraries for Hanami, you might reconsider your choice. If you have a lot of complex queries, you might need to get used to the fact that you will be moving between 3 layers of wrappers around the database. And last, I think that for simple CRUD applications, you might just use any other framework because it's just simple CRUD application. There is nothing special there, so you might just choose whatever. So that's it. Again, I'm working for a company called Caligo Solutions. We are a Singapore-based company, and we're hiring. My name is Greg, but really it's Grzegorz. And you've listened to one wonderful year with Hanami. Thank you.
All right, questions? All right, I had one though. What are your thoughts on Trailblazer? Does it work in conjunction with Hanami? Is it comparable, or how does it work?
I haven't used Trailblazer. Like, I know how the gem works. I use some libraries that are part of Trailblazer. So I think it started as a kind of a framework for Rails, but now it's generic Ruby framework. So you can use it. You can use it with Hanami, but it's kind of like a separate thing because Trailblazer, as far as I remember, it's only related to your domain logic.
Yeah, the business process.
You can just replace Hanami interactors with the Trailblazer libraries, like the operation, policy, etc. Yes. So it's just like kind of orthogonal. They work well together just because each of them is pure Ruby.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Any other questions? All right. Yes, wait, hang on. There you go. Just in time.
Hi. So can we go to the slide number 29?
29. You remember the number of the slide. This is 29.
Oh, no. The one which has got validations on controller methods, right? Oh, 28.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, as per my understanding, you validate for like each HTTP endpoint, right? Differently. Here.
Yes. So this class create is just one HTTP endpoint. Yes. Yeah. And it performs validations when this controller action is called. And the other example is not HTTP endpoint. This is just a normal object. As you can see, it doesn't include the my application action.
Yeah. So if you want like the this validation to be available for all the HTTP endpoints, then you just include it there. Is it so?
Can you repeat?
Yeah. So the create order helper class. So my question is, if you want to validate a particular resource for all the HTTP endpoints, where do you put it?
So you put it in a separate validation file, and then you have a module called, let's say, validate order, and then you can include this module in all the classes where you want it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Question? Yeah, sure.
Nice framework. So basically, if we compare Rails with Hanami, then all the Ruby gems will remain compatible with Hanami as well, right?
No, so this is what I mentioned. Like, lots of libraries in Ruby ecosystem are designed just to work with Rails. For example, I know I used to work for a while on a library called Sorcery. It's authentication library. And this library just relies on Active Record, and it relies on Action Controller. So you cannot use this library with Hanami. Unless, of course, you include Active Record and Action Controller in your Hanami application, but then it doesn't make sense to use Hanami. No, so you need to be aware whether the gem that you want to use, whether it relies on Rails or not.
Okay, one more question. So basically, whenever we use Rails, then first question comes to our mind is security. Right? So how much secure is Hanami? So
that's a very good question.
Are there any applications in production using Hanami as a framework?
Can you repeat the last question?
So are there any web applications in production right now?
Well, so my company has 2 applications running Hanami in production, yes. So regarding the security, so Hanami provides you with the basic stuff like, I know the database library helps you with SQL injection, the controller library helps you with the cross-site scripting, etc. It provides the cross-site request forgery prevention, etc. So it provides the basic, the most common stuff. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
One question, does this validation separation add some extra burden on application, or it is efficient than the Rails way?
Can you repeat? I don't understand.
I'm saying we add a validation on Rails model. Now we are separating it from the entities, right? And creating
the validation
actions.
from entities, yes, that's right.
So does it add extra burden on application and slows the validation process, or it is faster than the Rails?
I don't know if it has any impact on the performance. The thing here is that, so the separation is not for the performance. It is actually just to understand that the validating of the data is not necessarily related to the database, because you might want to validate something that doesn't end up in the database. You might want to validate just something that you pass the params correctly to a service, or that the controller receives correct parameters. So regarding performance, I don't know whether it adds any additional time or no. I don't think so, but I don't have any proof for that.
Okay, thanks. Nice framework.
Thank you.
And we got some more.
Hey, hi. To compare with it Rails for the REST application or microservices, how you will give a pros and cons of the Hanami?
Okay, so pros of Hanami are definitely that that it's more modular and that the different layers are well separate. Like, Hanami makes it very hard to make the database query from your HTML, which is extremely easy in Rails. Because in Rails, you can just embed code in HTML that says, I don't know, user.findBy something, right? And it is possible in Hanami, but you have to do some workarounds to make it work. So this is the pro. This is definitely the pro of the framework. Also, it's smaller and easier to read. Maybe because it doesn't provide so much functionality, but reading Ruby on Rails code is complex. It's difficult because the code is very complex. So Hanami, for now, is just easier to read. The pro of Rails instead is that it's so huge in terms of the ecosystem that you might write Rails application just by using bunch of gems and only calling the gems code. And in Hanami, sometimes to find the gem, it's impossible. So you will have to write a lot more code by yourself.
One more question, and I think we'll take the last question now.
How does it handle view part?
How does it handle what?
View part.
View part.
Yeah.
Views.
Yeah.
Views. Okay. So let me go back to these. Okay. So you see, in the controller, I basically assign the body. So if I want to render some file, I just use my view. So I have this view file. You see the index. So where is it? Here. Okay. So I call index.new.render. And this will generate the string, which is the whole HTML. So then in my controller, what I do is I say that self-body equals render.view. And this is how it handles that part. However, if you leave the call method empty, it will, just like in Rails, it will try to find the view called index, and it will try to find the HTML file called index, and it will render it.
All right, so Grzegorz, there are a lot more questions coming in. So during the breaks here, I'll ensure that Grzegorz is going to be here somewhere. So people who have more questions, please feel free to ask him. But thank you so much for the talk.
Sure, thank you very much.